The drought had lasted 14 months. Caleb Harrow knew this not because he kept a journal, he didn't, but because the last good rain had fallen the morning they buried Margaret, and the sky had been dry and indifferent ever since. As if the land itself had decided that if Margaret Harrow was gone, there was no longer any reason to be generous. He stood at the fence line of Ironwood Ranch at dawn, the way he did most mornings, one boot on the lowest rung, arms crossed over the top rail, staring at the brown and cracking earth that stretched toward the horizon like a busted promise. The cattle were thin. The creek that bisected his north pasture had narrowed to a trickle you could step across without wetting your ankles. 3 of his ranch hands had drifted to greener outfits, and the 2 who remained, old Hector and a young drifter named Cole, worked more out of loyalty than any confidence that Ironwood would survive another season. Caleb was 52 years old. He felt 70. He heard boots on the porch behind him and didn't turn around. A moment later, Doc Pruitt materialized at his shoulder, holding 2 tin cups of coffee, offering one without ceremony. Caleb took it. "You're going to wear a groove in that fence rail," Doc said. "Maybe the wood'll hold better than the land." Doc Pruitt was 60, lean as a fence post himself, with a white mustache and the particular brand of stubbornness that belongs only to country doctors and old mules. He had delivered Jesse into the world, set Caleb's broken arm after a horse disagreement in '71, and sat beside Margaret in her final hours. He was the closest thing to a conscience Caleb had left. "Boy still giving you trouble?" Doc asked. Caleb sipped his coffee. "Jesse's got his mother's fire without her grace. He'll come around." "Will he?" It wasn't a question, and both men knew it. Jesse Harrow, 17 and furious at the universe, had been a different creature since Margaret died. Not wicked, Caleb never thought that, but sealed shut. Like a strongbox someone had welded closed and thrown the key into the creek. They stood in silence for a while, the way old friends do, letting the morning breathe around them. "I've been thinking," Doc said finally. "That's usually where the trouble starts. You need a woman on this ranch, Caleb." Caleb said nothing, which Doc had learned over decades to treat as permission to continue. Not for sentiment, practically speaking. Doc wrapped both hands around his cup. Someone to manage the household, keep the accounts straight, maybe reach Jesse sideways where you've been going at him head-on. A partner. He paused. "There are reputable agencies, newspapers back east that carry advertisements, perfectly respectable arrangements." "You're talking about a mail-order bride." Caleb's voice carried no judgment, only flatness. "I'm talking about not dying alone on a dying ranch when you don't have to." Caleb turned that over in his mind the way you turn a stone with your boot, not picking it up, just examining what's underneath. He looked at the brown pasture, at the skeletal mesquite trees, at the sky that offered nothing. "I'll think on it," he said. He thought on it for 3 days. On the 4th, he sat at Margaret's writing desk, the one he hadn't moved, hadn't touched for almost 2 years, and he wrote an advertisement. He crossed it out twice. He wrote it again. When he was finished, he read it back to himself in the empty kitchen. "Widower, cattle rancher, West Texas, honest man, plain circumstances. Ranch requires capable woman unafraid of hard country and harder seasons. I offer a decent home, fair partnership, and my word kept. I am not a young man. I do not ask for youth in return, only character. C. Harrow, Drywater, Texas." He mailed it to 3 papers. He received 1 reply. It arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks later, in an envelope of good cream-colored paper. The handwriting was even and unhurried, the penmanship of a woman who had been properly educated but saw no need to show off about it. "Mr. Harrow, your advertisement was the only one I read that described a man rather than a requirement. I am 45 years of age, a widow of 6 years, and I have lived in St. Louis, though I was not born to ease. I can cook, manage accounts, tend the sick, and I am unacquainted with fear of hard country, having crossed it before. I will not send a photograph. If character is what you advertised for, character is what should be evaluated in person. If you are agreeable, I will arrive on the 14th on the Southern Pacific. Eleanor Voss." Caleb read it 4 times. He showed it to Doc Prewitt, who declared Alina Voss a woman of uncommon sense. He did not show it to Jesse, who found out anyway and delivered his verdict at supper. She's not replacing Mama. Jesse didn't look up from his plate. Nobody said she was. I'm just making sure you know. I know, Caleb said quietly, and they finished supper in silence. The 14th arrived the way significant days always do, indistinguishable from any other until it isn't. Caleb put on his good shirt. He told himself it was courtesy, not nerves, and ignored the fact that his hands were unsteady doing his collar button. He drove the wagon into Drywater alone, tied it outside the station, and stood on the platform with his hat in his hands while half the town found sudden reasons to be nearby. Martha Cleggins from the general store was wagering openly that the woman would be homely, desperate, or both. The station master kept glancing at Caleb with an expression caught between pity and entertainment. The Southern Pacific arrived 12 minutes late in a long exhale of steam. Passengers descended, a drummer with sample cases, a family with too much luggage, an old preacher. The platform crowd thinned, and then she stepped off. She was tall, dark-haired, with silver threading through it that she hadn't bothered to hide. Her traveling dress was the color of slate, plain but well-kept, and she moved through the steam and the noise with the quiet authority of a woman who had long ago decided she didn't require anyone's approval to occupy space. She was, and Caleb registered this with something like alarm, genuinely beautiful, in the way of things that have weathered honestly. Martha Cleggins went silent. The station master stood straighter. Caleb stepped forward, hat still in hand, and opened his mouth and then stopped. Because behind Alina Voss, gripping her hand with both of hers and pressing close to her side, was a small girl of about 10 years old, dark eyes wide and watchful, not letting go. Alina's gaze found Caleb's across the platform, steady as a compass needle. She walked toward him without hesitation. When she stopped, there was a foot of West Texas air between them and about 1,000 unspoken questions. "Mr. Harrow," she said. Her voice was level, unhurried. She held his gaze without flinching, and her hand tightened once around the little girl's. "Before you say a single word, there is something I must tell you." The platform crowd had the decency to pretend they weren't listening. They failed completely, of course. Martha Cleggins had drifted close enough that Caleb could smell her rosewater. The station master had discovered an urgent need to inspect the luggage cart not 6 feet away, but Caleb paid them no mind. His full attention had narrowed to the woman standing before him, and the child pressed against her side like a shadow that had learned to be afraid. "The girl," Alina said, without apology or decoration. "Her name is Rosa. She is 10 years old. Her mother was my dearest friend, a woman named Marisol, who died of fever on the trail from San Antonio 8 months ago." She paused, letting that settle. "I was with Marisol when she died. I held her hand. And I made her a promise that I intend to keep until I no longer draw breath." Alina's chin lifted slightly. "Rosa goes where I go, Mr. Harrow. That is not a negotiation. It is simply a fact." Caleb looked at the girl. Rosa looked back at him with dark, enormous eyes that had seen too much and learned to reveal nothing. She was small for 10, thin in the way of children who had known uncertain meals, but she stood straight beside Alina with a quiet dignity that reminded him, oddly and immediately, of the woman herself. He looked back at Alina. "She's sick." "No. She got any other people?" "None that want her." Caleb turned his hat over once in his hands. Behind him, he heard Martha Cleggins exhale sharply, already composing the story she would deliver to every customer for the next 2 weeks. He didn't care. He was looking at a 10-year-old girl who was gripping a woman's hand like it was the last solid thing in a flooding world, and he was thinking about a 17-year-old boy at home who had been doing the same thing, invisibly, for 14 months. "She can stay," he said. Alina held his gaze for a moment, as if measuring whether he meant it. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. She gave a single nod, not of gratitude, but of acknowledgement, one person of their word recognizing another. "Then let's collect the luggage," she said. The first weeks at Ironwood were, by any reasonable measure, a transformation. Alina Voss moved through the ranch house the way water moves through dry ground, quietly, efficiently, finding every crack and filling it without fanfare. Within 3 days, the kitchen had been reorganized in a way that made Hector, who had been cooking badly for 6 months, shake his head in admiring defeat and hand her the spoon without argument. Within a week, she had audited the ranch accounts, identified 2 billing errors with the feed supplier in Drywater, and corrected them by letter in handwriting that brooked no dispute. Cole, the young ranch hand who had expected to ignore her entirely, found himself eating the best biscuits of his life and developing an inconvenient respect. Rosa settled into the small room beside Alina's with the careful quietness of a child practiced in making herself invisible. She helped without being asked, folded her own blankets with precise corners, and spent her evenings bent over the worn Bible Alina used to teach her letters, her finger tracing each word slowly, her lips moving in silent determination. Jesse watched all of it from a careful distance, like a wolf observing a campfire, drawn to the warmth but unwilling to approach it. He was civil to Alina in the thin, surface way of someone who had decided on a policy. Toward Rosa, he was something worse than cruel. He was indifferent. He looked through her. When she passed him in the doorway, he stepped aside as if avoiding furniture. When she spoke once at supper, quietly asking if he wanted the salt, he reached across the table and picked it up himself, as if she hadn't made a sound. Alina watched this with calm, measuring eyes and said nothing. Not yet. It was Caleb who noticed the other things first. Alina rose before dawn every morning that he'd expected. She was a ranch woman in her bones. But twice in the first 2 weeks he'd seen her ride out alone on the mare he'd given her, heading not toward the pasture but northeast, toward the ridge road. She was back before breakfast, never explaining, never volunteering. He told himself it was her business. Then there was the letter. Hector brought it in from the post rider on a Thursday. Caleb happened to be in the kitchen when Alina opened it. He wasn't watching her, he was pouring coffee, but he caught the brief stillness that moved through her, the way her shoulders drew together for just 1 second before she folded the letter quickly and tucked it into her apron pocket. When she looked up, her face was composed and ordinary. "Anything important?" he asked, because he was a plain man and plain men ask plain questions. "Old business," she said. "Nothing that concerns the ranch." He let it go. He told himself it was her business. He told himself that twice more over the following days, with decreasing conviction. The man arrived in Drywater on a Wednesday, and by Thursday morning Caleb knew about him, because Doc Pruitt drove out to Ironwood with the particular urgency of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have. His name was Silas Greer. He was sharp-dressed for the frontier, dark-suited, with flat, pale eyes, and the unhurried manner of a man accustomed to getting what he came for. He had taken a room at the Drywater Inn and was asking questions about the Southern Pacific arrivals, about a woman traveling alone, about a woman traveling with a Mexican child. Caleb found Alina in the kitchen that evening after Jesse had gone to bed and Rosa had fallen asleep over her Bible. He sat across the table from her. He placed his hat on the wood between them. He looked at her directly, the way he looked at a man he needed the truth from. "There's someone in Drywater," he said, "looking for you." Alina went very still. Then slowly something behind her composed expression shifted, not collapsed, but yielded, the way a door yields when someone finally uses the right key. She sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table, and she told him everything. Rosa's mother Marisol had not only been Alina's friend. She had been the daughter of a land-holding family near the Rio Grande, modest land, perhaps 40 acres of river-fed ground, but legitimately deeded in Marisol's name and therefore, upon her death, belonging rightfully to Rosa. A man named Aldous Crane, a land baron who had been consuming small claims along the border like a fire consuming dry grass, wanted that deed. He had a lawyer named Silas Greer who specialized in making legitimate claims disappear through paperwork, pressure, and the quiet cooperation of territorial courts. Alina had spent the 8 months since Marisol's death gathering evidence letters, a copy of the original deed, a sworn statement from a San Antonio notary, and had already quietly sent copies to a federal judge in Austin. She needed time. She needed a lawful address. She needed a place Greer couldn't easily reach without revealing his purpose. "You came here for protection," Caleb said, "not accusation, fact." "I came here because your advertisement described an honest man," Alina said, and her voice was steady but not hard. "I will be your wife faithfully, Caleb. I will serve this ranch with everything I have. I did not deceive you about who I am." She held his gaze. "Only about the war I was already fighting." The kitchen was quiet. The lamp threw warm light across the table between them. Caleb sat with it. He thought about a woman who had crossed hard country, kept a deathbed promise, gathered evidence against a powerful man, and answered a rancher's advertisement in West Texas, all at once, with the same steady hands. A sound at the doorway made them both turn. Jesse stood in the shadow of the hall, having heard everything, wearing the expression of a boy ambushed by complexity he didn't know how to carry. He stared at them for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the rear of the house, and the back door opened and closed softly. Caleb rose to follow him. Alina touched his arm, stopping him. "Let him go," she said quietly. "He just needs a moment." Outside, behind the barn, in the blue darkness, Jesse Harrow found a small girl sitting on an overturned bucket, her knees pulled to her chest, having heard raised voices and understood enough to be frightened. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he walked over and sat down beside her in the dirt, his long legs folded awkwardly, staring out at the same darkness she was staring at. He didn't know what to say. He said the only true thing he had. "My mama's gone too." Rosa turned her face toward him slowly. "I know," she whispered. They sat together in the dark without another word, and something that had been sealed shut for 14 months opened, just slightly, like a door in a long-closed room, letting in the smallest draft of air. Silas Greer rode out to Ironwood on a Friday morning. He brought 2 men with him, hired muscle dressed as ranch hands, the kind of men whose eyes moved too quickly and whose hands stayed too close to their holsters. Greer himself rode a black horse that was too fine for honest work, and he approached the gate of Ironwood with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never yet been turned away from a door. Caleb was already on the porch. He had risen before dawn, dressed deliberately, and taken his rifle down from above the mantel, not with panic, but with the quiet purposefulness of a man settling an account he'd been expecting. He stood with the rifle resting in the crook of his arm, one shoulder against the porch post, watching the 3 riders come up the road through the pale morning light. Behind him, the front door was closed. Alina was inside with Rosa, and he had told them both, in a voice that didn't invite discussion, to stay there until he called. Greer pulled up at the foot of the porch steps and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, a greeting that was also a performance. "Mr. Harrow," he said pleasantly, "Silas Greer. I apologize for the early hour. I have a legal matter to resolve, and I find it's best to resolve these things before the day gets complicated." "What legal matter would that be?" Caleb said. "Not a question. A rope being measured." Greer reached into his coat slowly, aware of the rifle, and produced a folded document. "I represent Mr. Aldous Crane, who holds guardianship interest over a minor child currently residing on your property, a Mexican girl, approximately 10 years of age." He held the paper out. "This is a territorial writ authorizing transfer of the child to proper custodial care." "It's all in order, Mr. Harrow. I'm not here for trouble. I'm simply here for the girl." The 2 men behind him spread slightly, instinctively, the way trained dogs flank without being told. Caleb didn't take the paper. He looked at Greer for a long moment with the unhurried patience of a man who had spent decades reading weather and livestock and other things that couldn't speak plainly, but told the truth anyway. "That child," Caleb said, "is a member of this household, and no piece of paper carried by a stranger on a paid horse removes a member of my household from my property." He shifted the rifle slightly, not raising it, just reminding everyone it existed. "So you'll turn around, Mr. Greer, and you'll tell Aldous Crane that Ironwood Ranch is not one of his small claims." Greer's pleasant expression didn't vanish entirely, but it cooled at the edges. "Mr. Harrow, I'd encourage you to read the document before." The front door opened. Alina stepped onto the porch. She was dressed plainly, her dark hair pinned back, and she carried no weapon. What she carried was a leather satchel, worn at the corners from months of careful travel. She walked to Caleb's side and stood there, not behind him, beside him, and opened the satchel without hurry, producing a sheaf of documents that she held with both hands. "Mr. Grier," she said, with the calm of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for the better part of a year. "The writ you're holding was filed in a territorial court by a judge who receives a quarterly payment from Aldous Crane's land company. I have the bank records." She lifted the first document. "The original deed to the Rio Grande property is registered in Marisol Vega's name, witnessed and notarized in San Antonio in 1873, and transfers by direct lineage to her daughter Rosa upon her death." She lifted the second. "I have a sworn affidavit from the notary." The third. "And I have a letter of acknowledgement from Federal Judge Clarence Marsh in Austin, who received copies of all of this documentation 6 weeks ago, and has opened an inquiry into Crane's land acquisition practices along the border." She lowered the papers and looked at Grier with clear, steady eyes. "Aldous Crane is not Rosa's guardian," she said. "He is a man attempting to steal a 10-year-old girl's inheritance before she is old enough to claim it. And the federal court now knows his name." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a bluff collapsing. Grier stared at the documents. The pleasantness had left his face entirely now, replaced by a calculating stillness. His 2 men exchanged a glance behind him. One of them shifted in his saddle, and then from the road came the sound of horses. Jesse came first, riding hard, his hat gone and his dark hair flying, pushing the roan mare faster than Caleb had ever seen the boy ride. Behind him, at a more measured pace, came Sheriff Aldous Webb, a broad, gravel-voiced man who had disliked Aldous Crane for years with the quiet persistence of a man waiting for cause, and beside him, Doc Pruitt, who had apparently decided his medical bag was necessary and brought it along out of principle. Jesse pulled up hard at the gate, breathing fast, and looked at his father on the porch with an expression Caleb hadn't seen on the boy's face in 14 months. Not defiance, not grief. Something simpler and more valuable, the wide-open look of a young man who has just discovered that acting decisively feels better than standing still. "Got the sheriff," Jesse said, slightly out of breath. "Like you asked." Caleb hadn't asked. Jesse had gone on his own. Caleb looked at his son for a moment and felt something loosen in his chest, slow and enormous, like a knot worked free after long effort. "Good man," he said quietly. Sheriff Webb dismounted, reviewed Alina's documents with the thoroughness of someone who understood their significance, and informed Silas Grier with official plainness that the territorial writ was now under question pending federal review, and that removing any child from Ironwood Ranch under its authority would constitute a serious and well-documented error in judgment. Grier listened. He refolded his document. He looked once more at Alina, who looked back at him without blinking. Then he turned his black horse around and rode back down the road with his 2 men, and the dust settled behind them in the morning light. Doc Pruitt watched them go, then turned to Caleb with immense satisfaction. "Told you she was a woman of uncommon sense." Aldous Crane's operation did not collapse in a single day. Justice on the frontier rarely moved with the speed of a gunshot. It moved more like a river, slow and grinding, reshaping the ground beneath it over time. But it moved. The federal inquiry widened through the spring. 2 territorial judges resigned quietly. Crane sold 3 contested properties before the year was out, and his name became the kind that men in courtrooms said carefully, aware that it had become associated with consequence. Rosa's deed was formally registered in her name in the spring of 1880. Alina filed it herself in person at the federal land office in Austin, with Rosa standing beside her, wearing a new dress that Jesse had, with tremendous secrecy and awkwardness, asked Doc Pruitt's wife to help him purchase from the dry goods catalog. Rosa had said nothing when she unwrapped it. She had simply put it on and stood very straight in it, and the expression on her face was one that Alina would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. The wedding was small. Caleb and Alina stood under the broad arms of the old mesquite tree at the eastern edge of Ironwood, where the land dipped slightly and caught the evening light at an angle that made everything look like it had been gilded. Doc Pruitt read from his Bible in a voice that cracked only once, at a line about two becoming one that he'd read at Margaret's wedding 20 years prior. Hector and Cole stood to the side with their hats over their hearts. Jesse stood as witness, straight-backed and serious, older in the eyes than he'd been 6 months ago, in the way that comes not from suffering but from choosing. Rosa stood on Alina's other side, holding a small bunch of wildflowers she had gathered that morning from the dry creek bed. The first flowers to come up after the rain that had arrived, unannounced and generous, 3 days prior. When Doc Pruitt pronounced them married, Caleb looked at Alina, and Alina looked at Caleb, and between them passed something that had no ceremony adequate to contain it. The quiet recognition of two people who had each believed, privately and with good reason, that the chapter of their lives containing warmth and partnership was finished. Both of them had been wrong. Caleb kissed his wife once briefly, with great sincerity, and Jesse made a sound of mild protest that caused Rosa to laugh for the first time so freely and fully that everyone turned to look at her, surprised, and then laughed themselves, because it was the kind of laugh that doesn't ask permission and doesn't wait for the right moment. Years later, when Rosa was grown, she built a small schoolhouse on her mother's 40 acres near the Rio Grande. Adobe walls, 2 windows, a wood plank floor she sanded herself. She taught reading first, because Alina had taught her that letters were the first door, and all other doors followed from that one. Jesse helped her build it. He was not a man of many words by that point, but he was steady, and he showed up every morning with tools and without being asked, which Rosa had long since understood was his particular language of devotion. Alina grew old at Ironwood with the grace of someone who had never required comfort to be content, only purpose. She kept the accounts, tended the sick, expanded the kitchen garden to a size that embarrassed the original one, and sat on the porch every evening with Caleb, watching the West Texas sky perform its nightly extravagance of color. Caleb Harrow, widower rancher, a man who had stood at a fence line for 14 months watching his land die and feeling himself die alongside it, lived another 23 years. Good years, worked hard and held close. He had placed an advertisement for a bride. He had written honestly that he offered a decent home, fair partnership, and his word kept. Alina Voss had read it and decided he was worth the trouble. She had been right. So, as it turned out, had he. The drought, which had lasted 14 months, never came back quite so badly again. The land remembered water. The land recovered. It put out new grass the following spring, green and improbable and stubborn, growing up through cracked ground the way things do when they have decided, against considerable evidence, to survive. Which is, when you consider it, not so different from the rest of the story.